Welcome back to PLS 510. Today I'd like to take up part 2 in our pasture management lecture series, and I'm going to start by reminding you of the pasture goals that we have set out as the generic goals for this pasture that we will talk about. We want a long grazing season, we want adequate intake and quality, we want good utilization, at least achievable utilization. We want maximum regrowth possible, and we want the forages that we have to persist. So let's get started. We've talked all semester long about adding things into our pasture system, and of course, our Kentucky pastures are primarily the yellow, cool season perennial grasses, and you can see the seasonal peak of growth in the spring and a smaller peak in the fall. We've talked about adding perennial warm season grasses or annuals to fill in the summer gap. And this the size of this peak is actually proportional to the yield. And it's one of the things that makes it tricky to manage perennial or any of the warm season grasses is that they are very high yielding in a very short period of time. We will do some things. We can also do some things to add grazing in the fall. And I've got to tell you that this October-November period tends to be fairly difficult to fill with new species because this falls are typically the driest point of the year for us in Kentucky. So we may not be able to get a lot of growth from planted winter annuals like small grains or annual ryegrass or the brassica species like turnips. But in some years, you certainly can. Of course, these winter annuals are going to come into their own and will really grow a lot, and will let us get onto some pasture land a little sooner in the spring. Of course, we are here in the middle of March or the latter part of March right now, and you can see that our cool season pastures are starting to grow quite rapidly. And if you happen to have some small grain pastures near you, you can see that they are also ahead of our cool seasons. So in order to have the longest possible grazing season, we've got to have a mix of these things. Our second goal was having enough quality and quantity. I think we started with quantity, and quality was the second, to achieve our performance goals. And I've got 3 pictures here, and I'll just go starting in the upper left. That's an Angus cow grazing a brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass field in Princeton. And you can see that these get very tall, and the animals have to then use their tongues and reach out and wrap around those forages and rip them then off from the plant. If you were to see what that looks like when you have gotten most of the grazing off of that you need to, it just will look like standing sticks in the field. So intake is a function of the quantity that is present. On the right-hand upper right, or the right-hand side picture, that's an Angus heifer eating an alfalfa orchard grass bite. And you can clearly see the tongue wrap around the grass and the legume and pull it into the mouth. The middle picture is a goat chewing on a cocklebur plant. Goats tend to graze differently in that they've got an articulated lip that can move around and on forages and graze quite differently than the cow, who has to reach out with his or her tongue and rip off the forage. And sometimes, if it's really short, they have to trap the forage with between the bottom teeth and the upper dental pad, because cows don't have teeth in the upper part of their mouth, just a pad. So the goats are going to eat differently, and they will certainly eat low-growing forages, but they do like to eat what we call browse. In other words, low-growing plants like shrubs, and they can be quite useful to defoliate some problem weeds. Like in this same field with this goat and the cocklebur were ironweed plants, and these goats were enjoying quite a bunch those 2 weedy species. But we have to make sure that we've got enough quantity present that the animal can get enough dry matter intake for them to perform. Now, I have borrowed this forage quote from Jim Garrett. Pasture performance is 75% quantity and 25% quality. Now, I need to explain this just a little bit. It was based on some research done at the University of Missouri, where they actually regressed the pasture yield against performance and the pasture quality against performance. And when they worked out the statistics, most of the performance of the animal was related to having more forage to eat. Some of it was, in fact, related to quality, but it's mostly quantity. So in our pasture goals, we need to, it's paramount to keep in mind that the yield is going to be the first thing we are searching for and driving for with almost every forage that we're going to use in a pasture system. Now, this is cool season species. It's interesting to note that they found that the proportion was more 50-50 for warm season grasses. And here is my take on why. Certainly intake and the amount is important, but one of the things that is true on warm season grasses is that when they get mature, the performance on mature warm season grasses declines quite rapidly. So even for warm season grasses, the quantity of pasture available is still going to be at least half or more of the account for half or more of the gain. So the first thing we have to do is have enough forage. We can manage it so that the quality is good, but the first thing we have to do is to have enough forage. And I've already made this point, but livestock eat differently, and generally you're going to want every mouthful to be full and easy to get. My major professor, when I got my PhD, was into the idea of how many bites can a cow or a steer take in a minute, and then to have how big are those bites, and what kind of pasture, canopy, or structure do you have to present to the animal in order for them to maximize their intakes with the number of bites that they take. And he actually put microphones on these animals and taped their eating activity, and then played back the tapes and counted the number of bites that they took, because it's very audible. They rip, it's rip, rip. And what he found is that the bite rate could approach 60 bites per minute. That is 1 per second. So, they are very actively grazing out there. But what he also found is that when the pastures got very short, they could not compensate and take more bites in order to achieve full intake. Now, I'd like you to do something for me. I'd like you to visualize a field with no grazing or haying and just letting it grow. So I want you to draw a graph indicating the total yield from left to right, starting down towards the where those two lines come together. And then I want you to draw the line for total yield, and then separate and portion that out into green and dead material. So over time, how much of the material will be green and how much of it dies, and when does that happen? So pause the lecture and sketch that out, if you will, on a piece of paper. Okay, let's take a look. This is what it looks like typically for our cool season species. Starting in the lower left, the growth starts, and we have a lag phase, and we get a rapid phase, and then we will have the growth rate slows as you reach the point where all the light is intercepted in that pasture. And if you let it continue to grow at that point without harvest, what you find is that the green tissue proportion goes down. You do not add much more in the way of yield, because you are losing tissue because of its age and also because it's shaded. So the point here is that our grazing management has got to be such that we let the forage grow rapidly, but then we wind up harvesting it at this stage here so that we get high yields but we also want to leave enough green tissue that the regrowth is quick as well. Another principle we have to think about in this pasture management system is what is our target utilization, or another way to think of it is how much of the pasture that or the forage that we grow can we get inside the grazing animal. And one of the biggest determinants of that is how frequently we rotate, starting from never, in other words, continuous grazing, to a month or longer, 4 to 7 days, every 3 days, daily or twice daily. What are the reasonable expectations for utilization? So I'll let you think about that for just a second, and then we'll move on. These are some values that are pulled from the NRCS Graze tool that I've had you use. There's a little cheat table or a little help table that says if you're trying to, of course, the Graze tool is for working with producers, and if they're able to rotate every 4 to 7 days, then using a utilization of 50 to 55% is going to be reasonable. If they want to rotate more, if they want to have higher utilization, they got to be willing to rotate more frequently, or at least be there on site to rotate if needed. And then to get up in the very high utilization numbers, then you're looking at moving them daily or twice daily. So if you want to think about your NRCS Graze model scenarios that you're going to run or have run, using a utilization of 50 to 60% is going to be doable for most of our grazing operations. So another goal in our pasture management scheme is to manage for maximum regrowth. And I'd remind you that pasture management must balance growth with defoliation. And this is the standard S-shaped curve that we've talked about so much, that right after defoliation, the growth is slow. Depending on the species, this may come from all carbohydrates in the root, like alfalfa, or you may be able to use a mix of stored carbohydrates in the crown, along with photosynthate from green leaf tissue that's left. And that would be a scenario like with tall fescue or orchard grass. And at some point, you've expanded enough leaf area that you're able then to enter this rapid phase of growth up to a point, and then your growth rate will slow down because of the age of the leaf and because you're going to start to get shading, as we drew in that graph earlier. I want to introduce the idea that stocking rate and gain per animal and gain per acre is related. And this is actually from your pocket guide, but I'm going to be focusing in on the next slide on this graph to the right. And that is the relationship of animal output and the pasture stocking rate. This is a very important graph, and certainly one that we keep in mind all the time when we're talking about pasture management and varying the stocking rate, or how many animals you're carrying on a pasture. And that's at the bottom. So let's start here in the lower left and take this graph apart. First of all, the vertical axis is going to be animal growth, or just pounds this way. The horizontal axis is stocking rates in terms of animals per acre. So we're starting here with very low stocking rate and moving to very high. So when we have a very low stocking rate and the animal has run of the whole pasture and they can choose the absolute best that they want, and the intake is not limited, then our output per animal is going to be quite high. But it's uneconomical because we waste so much of the forage. So we're not utilizing the forage. So we may have one animal that gets very good gains, but the gain per acre then is going to be poor, and that's what the solid line is. So as we move to the right and increase the stocking rate, then obviously our gain per acre goes up. At this time, though, you've got less selectivity possible by the grazing animals, and so they're going to be having to eat some of the forage that they may not choose to eat. readily, or maybe they're having to eat further down into the canopy and they can't cherry pick the very best. So you have a decline in individual animal performance. And somewhere in the middle, and the what you've got an optimal zone where you've got enough animals per acre such that your output per land area is high enough, or at least is going to be adequate for you. And it's not so heavily grazed that you wind up being, with the pastures underperforming. So we recognize that this is a trade-off, that the fewer numbers of animals that we have, the higher the gain per animal, but the lower the gain per acre. And as you increase stocking rate, then your gain per acre will move up to a point that then can be optimized based on whether or not your pastures are recovering, and whether or not your performance per animal is going to be acceptable. And in this idea of utilization, I want to remind you again that pasture management is not about what you take. One of the errors I think people make when they first start a rotational grazing system is that, by gosh, I can fence off these animals into such a small area, I can really up my utilization. Well, in point of fact, you can, but it is not going to be the best management for the grass, because different grasses and different species need to have different residuals left. And we'll talk about this just a little bit. We've talked about tall fescue, bluegrass, and orchard grass quite a bit, in that they differ slightly in how much residual height they need. Orchard grass, for example, needs more to persist and to regrow. Kentucky bluegrass is lower growing, it needs less. And Kentucky 31 tall fescue is in the middle, it's intermediate. Upright native grasses like switchgrass need quite a bit of residual height left, because they need that's where the stored carbohydrates are. Now, alfalfa is kind of a whole different beast when we talk about when to stop. Because alfalfa comes back totally from the crown, then why would you stop at 2 or 4 inches? Because it doesn't make any difference for the regrowth. Well, here's why. If you think about that previous graph where we're overgrazing, or where we're really hammering it and getting all of the forage that's available, and we're up in this zone, then we've got the animal performance is dropping in terms of individual animal performance, because when you get down to the last 4 or 5 inches on alfalfa, it is completely just stem, and it is much lower in energy than the top 2/3 of the canopy. So that's why we say for a legume like alfalfa or red clover that it is not beneficial to graze very, very low in the canopy, even if they are not going to, that last 2 to 4 inches does not help with the speed of regrowth. And I want to take this moment to say that overgrazed forages underproduce. Same thing we've been saying. Here's an example of an overgrazed orchard grass plant on the left, clipped 4 times a month at 1 inch versus 1 time a month at 4 inches. And you can see that this plant on the right is going to, certainly in the next grazing cycle, yield quite a lot more than the pot on the left. I want to remind you of this data that we've looked at before, that when we don't utilize pasture at all, that the annual yield is not what it could be than when we have a moderate amount of utilization. This is no nitrogen on the left and 90 pounds on the right, and various levels of utilization from 0, the lightest bar, 20, 40, 60, and 80% as the bars get darker. And you can see that the production was best with nitrogen. Oh, that's not very much of a surprise. This is a warm season grass, but that we were able to get actually higher annual yields when we harvested about half, 40% of the forage, than when we didn't harvest as much. And certainly we could overgraze and harvest less. So we know that this is a trade-off. How much we take will impact how much growth or how much yield we get on the forage. This is from that same study, the same type of graph. This is root growth. On the left is no nitrogen, on the right is 90 pounds of nitrogen. And you can see that when we don't defoliate, the root growth of the root mass is the largest. And every time we defoliate, we reduce the root mass available. It's interesting that the reduction is pretty steep here where we don't fertilize with nitrogen. Nitrogen was able to mitigate that to some degree in the bars to the right. But defoliation in this example always had an impact on root growth. And I wanted to mention this set of data adapted from the University of Georgia for a couple of reasons. Number one is it speaks to how successful we will be with stockpiling tall fescue in the fall. And then that success is going to be mitigated by what we do in the summer plus the weather. And so let's work through this graph. The horizontal on the horizontal axis are two sets of bars. One is a dry year and one's a wet year. The vertical axis is tall fescue dry matter yield for the fall. The white or the totally open columns are when we defoliate low, we closely graze in the summer. And the cross-hatched bars are when we leave a lot or 3 inches of residual height in the summer. And of course, a dry year and a wet year. So the difference in fall growth is much more marked in that dry year as it's affected by the summer growth. In a wet year, not so much. This played out for me in a Hardin County field day where we absolutely got the nitrogen on at the right amount of time, pulled the cattle off mid-August, which is quite early in people's minds to be thinking about fall fescue growth. And we came back to the field day in November, and it had been a very dry fall, and we had a yield much like this very lowest column down here on the left. Why? Because in August, he had that pasture as well short, down to I'd say 1 inch of height or 1 to 1.5 inches, and we just did not get any regrowth. Interestingly enough, in a hayfield, same forage just across a fence that hadn't had anything on it, no nitrogen at all, we got a lot of yield where we got nothing on the stockpile. And it taught me the lesson that if you're going to try to stockpile tall fescue, and it's a good practice, don't overgraze in the summer. And one more point about root growth. This is from Jim Green in North Carolina, where they had fescue cut to 2 inches every week, cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks, or cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks. So in this case, the amount of defoliation in the upper growth was roughly the same, but look how they just changed the frequency. And look at both the vigor of the above ground growth, but look at the size of the root mass going left to right, cut every week, cut every other week, and cut every 4 weeks. And even though there's nothing really magical about 4 weeks, it is surprising to me how frequently it comes up as a kind of cardinal number for grazing systems. So cut to 2 inches every 4 weeks, we had a lot more root mass than these other scenarios. And the last point that in our outline for this lecture is persistence. Rotation is going to allow persistence of high quality upright legumes and highly palatable grasses. So I'm going to have you pause your lecture and think about and write down a few examples of these forages that are going to persist much better under rotational grazing. Okay, let's move forward. Here are the examples I came up with. Number one would be alfalfa, and that's what's in the picture. Native warm season grasses are also going to be in that class. Orchard grass is going to be in there. Endophyte free tall fescue, which is very palatable, needs to be rotated in order to persist and to yield well. And then finally, the novel endophyte varieties of tall fescue will fall into this class as well. So let's draw this lecture to a close and say that our pasture management goals are going to be having the longest possible grazing season, to have enough forage that intake as well as quality is not limiting, to have an appropriate amount of utilization. And for our systems, most of the time that's going to be between 45 and say 60%, to manage so that we have maximum regrowth and manage so that we have persistence. And the best way to do this is to have some subdivided pasture system with adequate water distributed through it. So, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you next time.